Last June, the US rating agency Standard & Poor's downgraded the credit rating of French bonds to AA-. But okay, what does that mean? It means that the French economy has gone from being harder than cement to being less reliable than a slot machine. Among the other reasons are its huge public spending, its already very high taxes, and yet the country is still running a skyrocketing deficit. Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire has said that the problems are one-off, and that, well, they've needed to spend a lot of money lately to combat inflation and unemployment caused by COVID. But let's be clear, spending lavishly has been a constant in France since time immemorial, and the problem is no longer just that they are wasteful, but that when presidents like Macron have tried to bring order and cut back a little, well, judge for yourselves. Imagine how serious the spending problem has to be for a politician like Macron to constantly insist on cuts, despite having half the country burning the streets every time he tries. The French deficit is one of the largest in the entire Eurozone, even larger than that of Greece or Spain, which, as you know, are not exactly known for being tight-fisted. And if the French budget balance is concerning, let's not forget its economic performance. Along with Germany, France has become one of the worst economic performers on the continent, even though the data corresponds to 2022, when the COVID recovery should, in theory, be helping. The world seems upside down, don't you think? Where has the mighty French Empire gone? It seems incredible that during the 20th century, France was one of the most prosperous economies in the world, and now we see it like this. So the question today is, what has changed? Why is France in free fall? And why does it seem to have no solution? Well, let's take a look. Perhaps France's biggest problem is the weight of the state. I don't know if you realized, but France is the developed economy with the highest public spending over GDP in the world. So we could say that the socialism of the Soviet Union may have fallen, but the French are already following in its footsteps. And the problem is no longer just a large state, but everything that goes with it. I'm talking about a lot of public spending that requires a lot of taxes. France charges the highest taxes in relation to the GDP of the entire Eurozone and the European Union. The figure is almost double that of Ireland. We could almost say that these days, the French work more to finance the state than for themselves. Conclusion? Well, companies pay the price. Nowadays, there are hardly any new companies with potential, as there used to be in the past. Large corporations such as Renault and Louis Vuitton no longer appear, and what can I say? It's not surprising either. The Heritage Foundation, which compiles and publishes the Index of Economic Freedom, states that the Gallic nation is not even among the 60 countries with the greatest economic freedom. That is to say, it's at the level of countries, hold on to your chair, such as Vietnam, Guatemala, or Vanuatu. But what if I told you that this wasn't always the case? Remember that for many years, France was an industrial powerhouse. I mean, at some point, the state had to be different than it is now. Well, do you know when it all changed? In 1977. That year, France implemented one of the largest increases in public spending ever recorded in history. It's scandalous. The state went from having a weight of less than 22% to more than 44% in 1978. This is known in economics as Parkinson's law, and it means that when the government raises public spending, it's very difficult to cut it in the future. When money is plentiful, bureaucrats have incentives to make unnecessary expenditures. They hire underlings to take work off their hands, commission reports to justify the importance of their jobs, or the politicians themselves use the surplus to win new voters. And of course, let's see who's the smart one when the going gets tough. Who cuts all those new expenses? Because by then, it seems that expenses are understood as rights that cannot be withdrawn. For example, that the cost of pensions have risen too high and need to be moderated. Pensioners' demonstration. That there are too many journalism schools and it's necessary to close some of them in order to set up medical schools. Faculty strike. That unemployment benefits are excessive. That they're discouraging people from working and should be cut back. The unemployed strike, if that's possible. But this is no longer just a joke. It's what Macron has been dealing with over the last few years.
More than 1 million protests across France against Macron's pension reform.
In short, spending more is very easy and politically correct, but cutting back is almost impossible, which explains why states such as France's are only growing. But one thing is clear. From this discussion, we cannot overlook what happened in 1977. In other words, it's one thing for public spending to tend to grow, and quite another for it to double in just 1 year. So what the hell happened that year? Was Stalin's spirit reborn on the streets of Paris? The 1970s were like a cocktail shaker of disasters for the Western economy. On the one hand, there was the oil crisis, which, as you know, caused inflation to soar and industry to collapse. Automobiles, electricity, luxury items, almost all production was linked to dinosaur juice. But take note, because apart from the oil crisis, during the 1970s, there was another massive problem that nobody talks about. This was the same period in which Japan, China, and South Korea developed sufficiently to compete with their Western counterparts. The domestic market share of the legendary French automakers went from almost 100% to just over half. But the fashion brands also had to face competition from low-cost producers. And you may be wondering, were the Asian countries really such big competition for France? I mean, sure, they had cheap labor, but heck, France was still France, one of the biggest manufacturing powers on the planet. Are you seriously telling me that they couldn't adapt? Well, no, and that had a lot to do with the subsidy policy carried out in the previous years by Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was the military man and president who oversaw the early years of the Gallic country following the Second World War. One of his plans was to rebuild the country after the conflict was the so-called Monet Plan of 1946, a plan that was largely devoted to investing in infrastructure, but above all, to directing, subsidizing, and protecting large French companies. And you will say, so what's the problem? The problem is that excessive aid ended up fostering a complacent and stagnant business culture. Being subsidized, protected by the government, and with artificially low competition, companies stopped prioritizing innovation or the creation of new products. Proof of this is that investment in research and development was one of the lowest in the Western world until the oil crisis, not even 0.5% of GDP in 1967. And keep in mind, I'm not saying that the French economy was inefficient or technologically backward, far from it. What I'm saying is that constant state supervision created an industry that was rigid and lacking in dynamism, without the necessary experience to be able to compete adequately. The outcome? Well, when the protections were removed and foreign competition arrived, 1. French producers were no match for the rest of the world, and 2. They were not ready to pick up the pace either. And if we add the oil crisis, we have the perfect storm. Its economy, one of the richest on the planet, has gradually stagnated since the onset of the crisis, going from rates above 5% to rates of around 1 to 2% annual economic growth. The unemployment rate soared from 3% in the 1970s to more than 10% in the 1980s, a figure that the Gallic country has never achieved to return back to the 70s level since then. So with the crisis putting more and more people out of work and inflation liquefying workers' wages, social unrest swept through France. So let me ask you, what do you think the French did next? Indeed, what they do best: protest. Demonstrations swept across the country, and the president at the time, Valéry Giscard, decided to act as quickly as possible to calm the streets. And what did he do? Yes, you guessed it. He ramped up public spending, the same public spending that doubled the weight of the state in just 1 year. Congratulations, Valéry, you made France a tax hell today. Joking aside, Valéry's objective, beyond calming the demonstrators, was to protect national industry from the inclemency of the 1970s. Now, as we always say, it's one thing to write checks with lots of zeros, but it's another thing to make those checks pay off. And what can I tell you? Valéry Giscard doubled spending in desperation. He doubled it in just 1 year. Can it really be said that this was the result of a thoughtful, calm, and technically rigorous plan? Well, hardly likely. And there is no better proof of this than to see how since that time the industry has barely raised its head, while the only thing that has remained standing is uncontrollable debt and taxes. If you thought that France's problems were limited to public spending, you're wrong. Next to that and the Eiffel Tower, there is nothing more French than enjoying some of the strictest labor protections on the planet. For starters, the social security contributions paid by both employers and employees in 2022 were the highest in Europe, almost 15% of GDP in contributions alone. This gigantic collection is what makes the social security system in France one of the most comprehensive, providing healthcare, unemployment benefits, pensions, and family allowances to all workers. But naturally, it also makes it more expensive to create new jobs in the country, which generates higher levels of unemployment and hinders investment. On top of that, France maintains a relatively high minimum wage, which ensures a higher standard of living for workers, but further increases labor costs for employers, while increasing unemployment. This is in addition to very rigid labor laws such as harsh limitations on working hours, generous vacation policies, and strict regulations on layoffs. And as the icing on the cake, all new parents in France are entitled to parental leave, with mothers receiving up to 16 weeks of maternity leave, and fathers receiving up to 11 consecutive days. So what does all this translate into? France has one of the highest labor costs in Europe, and that's just counting wages and social security contributions, without taking into account other factors such as vacation time. And let's see, in an environment where companies don't invest too much in capital, where there are no significant startups or groundbreaking patents, yes, the last alternative seems to be to compete with affordable labor, but they can't do that either, because the state shoots up costs. Because I don't know about you, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the textile and automobile industries, which are highly dependent on labor, have been the hardest hit since the 1970s. At the end of the day, it's the same old story. What should have been laws protecting the interests of workers have turned into heavy burdens that slow down economic growth, business development, and investment. So much so that the government itself has already reconsidered changing its traditionally interventionist approach.
Lowering labor costs has become the cornerstone of French economic and social policies.
Visualeconomik community, France is the clear example that high public spending and a regulated labor market are not necessarily the best for workers or the economy in general. In fact, they have the potential to significantly worsen a country's economic situation, leading to indebtedness, inefficiency, stagnation, and complacency. Added to this are the effects of years of protectionism that left domestic industry weak against foreign competition, something that will be very difficult to resolve without a real paradigm shift in French economic policy. But what do you think? Do you think the French economy will continue to decline in the coming years, or do you think the situation will improve in the future? Don't forget to leave us your answers below in the comments box. And don't forget to hit like on this video if you liked it. And if you want to support our channel, you can subscribe and follow us on our social media accounts. Take care, and I'll see you in a future video.